Hi everyone, and welcome to The Neverending Story, The Cultural Evolution of Narratives, Part 2. This is the second of two introductory lectures, and in this lecture we'll be going into more detail about cultural evolution theory, and also how it has been applied to understanding narratives and stories. We'll be talking about the methods that cultural evolution researchers have used to better understand the patterns of distribution of stories, how they change as they pass from one person to another, and how they've changed over time. This lecture is by me, Joe Stubbersfield, and by Jamie Tarani. Once upon a time. Darwinian natural selection was proposed by Charles Darwin in On the Origin of Species, and has three key principles: variation, that there should be a variety of traits; inheritance, that traits should be passed from parent to offspring; and competition, that some traits must be selected for while others are not. If these three key principles are met, then natural selection occurs. The foundational concept of cultural evolution theory is that human culture meets these three principles, and therefore culture evolves in a Darwinian sense. As examples of human culture, narratives meet these three key principles, and therefore also can be said to evolve in a Darwinian sense. The psychologist Frederick Bartlett said in 1920 of stories that each event or incident in a narration possesses a certain potency of reproduction. The underpotent is omitted, the normally potent is reproduced, the overpotent is not only reproduced, but may so dominate all the rest as to change the whole course of the narration. Essentially, Bartlett here is proposing the cultural evolution of narratives, as he's suggesting that there is variation in the events or incidents within the narration, that they go through a process of inheritance, they're reproduced, and that there is competition between the different variations in terms of their potency, so in terms of how likely they are to be selected. But how may these three key principles of variation, inheritance, and competition be reflected in narrative evolution? So a key example of the variation we see in narratives would be the Arndt-Thompson-Uther Index, which identifies over 2,000 international tale types in over 300 cultures. So not only does this show huge variation across different tales found in different cultures, but also it records different variations of single tale types. So for example, ATU 333, Little Red Riding Hood, is found to vary widely across different cultures. While the core elements remain the same, there is distinct variation in the versions of this same story. Similarly, a related story, ATU 123, The Wolf and the Kids, is also found to vary across cultures while retaining key elements. In terms of inheritance, we know that stories are socially transmitted, and the social transmission of cultural traits can occur, like in many examples of biological transmission, from parent to offspring. But also we can see horizontal transmission in cultural evolution. So this is where it's transmitted within a generation. And we can see this in narratives, as we often might tell stories to our friends or receive stories from our friends. Narratives also show competition and differential selection. No one person can know all stories that have been produced by humans across time. This picture shows a library in Dublin, and even though this would only represent a relatively small number of the stories that humans have produced in history, it would be impossible for any one person to know all these stories. So we have the process of selection occurring in terms of what we attend to, what stories we listen to. And once we've done that, there's also selection in terms of recall. Some stories will be more memorable than others and more likely to be retained in our memory. So this is another level of selection. Once again, when it comes to transmitting those stories that we remember, selection may occur again. Some stories we may have heard and remember, but will never tell another person. Others we may tell again and again. But why does this matter? Why does it matter that narratives may meet these key principles of variation, inheritance, and competition? It matters because if stories and narratives evolve like organisms, then we can use methods that are used to examine biological evolution to examine this cultural evolution. It also provides a valuable framework through which we might be able to predict how stories might evolve in future. So in terms of the methods that are used within the field of cultural evolution to examine the evolution of narratives, there's a wide range of things that are applied. In this lecture, we'll be discussing three key methods which have been used to examine the cultural evolution of narratives. These being transmission chains, corpus analysis, and phylogenetic trees. Transmission chains were pioneered by Frederick Bartlett and work in a similar way to the childhood games of Chinese whispers or telephone. So in a transmission chain experiment, the first set of participants, who are known as Generation 1, receive the original material. So in many experiments in narrative evolution, this might be the text of a story. They then read that material and have to remember it. The product of their recall, what they remember, is then used as the material for the second group of participants, or Generation 2. This process is repeated down the chain of participants, and it allows for the examination of the cumulative effects of transmission along the chains. This kind of experimental approach reveals the processes of transmission by allowing us to answer questions like what aspects of the original material are remembered, what aspects are passed on along the chain, what parts of a story are preserved through transmission, and also what changes are introduced as the story is transmitted along the chain. The second method that we'll introduce here is corpus analysis. This comes from the field of digital humanities and is a form of text analysis. But unlike traditional approaches where the text may be coded by hand, this uses computational approaches to analyze large volumes of text. This means it's possible to make comparisons between texts at a large scale and answer questions that might be impossible to do with coding by hand. It allows the examination of the cultural evolution of stories at a macro level, beyond the kind of micro level processes that are being examined in the transmission chains. So you might be able to see how genres have changed across long periods of time, or examined how different aspects of stories are preserved in culture over long periods of time. The final method that we'll be talking about in this lecture is a phylogenetic approach. So this is a method that has been directly borrowed from biological evolution, evolutionary biology, where it's used to examine how biological traits are preserved in evolution and also answer questions about convergent evolution and so on. A phylogenetic approach has a fairly long history in terms of application to culture, as constructing trees of linguistic evolution has a long history and has been applied to a wide range of different language families. In terms of thinking about how the phylogenetic approach might be applied to the cultural evolution of narratives, we might want to think about how, for instance, a folk tale could be broken down into key components that could then be used in a phylogenetic analysis. So, for instance, if we were thinking about the tale of Red Riding Hood and the different variations that are collected in the Thompson-Uther index, we can see how they might vary in key points that could be used in this type of analysis. So, for instance, the main character could be the daughter going out to visit a grandmother or a mother. The monstrous creature that she encounters on her journey and is attacked by might be a wolf, a tiger, or an ogre, depending on where the story is from. Also, the conclusion of the story might vary. So it might be that this character is eaten by the monster and that's the end of the tale, or she might manage to escape, or she might be eaten by the monster but ultimately be rescued by a woodcutter. All these points of variation can be used to construct a phylogenetic tree of this particular tale. So in his paper, The Phylogeny of Little Red Riding Hood, Jamie Tarani did exactly this and created a phylogenetic tree, reconstructed this tree of evolution of Red Riding Hood and also the related tale, The Wolf and the Kids. So in conclusion, we can see that cultural evolution applies a Darwinian approach to understanding culture. And as examples of human culture, narratives also go through this process. Narratives show the key features of variation, heredity, and competition. And because of this, researchers are able to apply cultural evolution methods to better understanding that evolution. Researchers examine the cultural evolution of narratives using transmission chains, corpus analysis, and phylogenetic trees.